morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. We're going to be talking about fighting cloud costs and optimizing reliability with AWS Well Architected Review. Thank you for being here. We appreciate a lot your participation. I am Maria, and I will be your host for today. So our webinar will be running for about approximately 1 hour, and we'll be having 15 minutes at the end to answer your questions. So please feel free to do them or to ask them on the chat. Someone will be monitoring those at the end. So I will be very pleased to introduce you to our speaker today, Ken Pomella. He is a seasoned tech industry leader with more than 2 decades of experience. He has worked on Fortune 500 companies and served as an advisor, mentor, and fractional CTO to high growth startups, contributing with significantly to their ability to scale. As CEO of RevStar for 15 years, he specializes in helping middle market business leverage cloud native technology. He also is committed to philanthropic and endeavors, and he dedicates his time and resources giving back to the community. He is very driven by a strong belief in the power of technology to create meaningful change and opportunity. So welcome, Ken. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Maria. How about
Nice.
yourself?
I am doing very good. Thank you. Okay, so now that we have the pleasure to introduce you, I would like to jump in right away into the questions. So here we go. Just one more minute, please. Okay, here we go. So diving right in, you have been working in bleeding edge tech and cloud native technologies for nearly 2 decades. As tech continues to evolve at an exponential pace, how is this problem set changing for modern CTOs and business leaders?
It's a great question. So I think CTOs have to have a lot of tools in their toolkit now, right? So coming from an app dev background, things like security and compliance were things you didn't think about, right? They were, maybe important to certain companies and certain sectors, certain parts of IT, but now they are vital to everything you do. You have, AI is becoming a thing, right? So ethics are now important, right? Those were things that many people didn't really have to think about with the technology they were rolling out. With the rapid pace that new technology is coming out, how do you balance innovation with maintaining legacy systems and handle team members wanting to work on the new fun stuff versus the things that keep the business going. So yeah, it's definitely more than technology, right? You have to consider a lot of factors now if you're in a leadership role.
Okay, so let's do like a quick poll of the audience. Like, how many of you fall into these categories that Ken is talking about? Like, are you dealing with an entire different problem set altogether? So please comment that on our chat. And diving into the next question, Ken, and before we get into a deeper discussion, like, why are we even talking about well-architected review framework today? Like, what can our audience hope to gain from this discussion?
I think the things that a well-architected review cover are pretty vital to any business, right? We're talking about reliability of systems, the cost, and especially here in a time where the economic climate isn't the best. How much money you're spending running workloads on the cloud is, I think, at the forefront of everybody's mind. Scalability as you grow. So I don't know too many leaders in IT who aren't constantly faced with those issues. So I think they're pretty important to everybody. I think this conversation just I think mostly walking away with some ideas, maybe on some technologies that can help solve some of these problems.
Okay, nice. So now let's move to practical strategies that companies or organizations can adopt to strike that delicate balance between cost efficiency and peak performance. So, what strategies can businesses implement to maintain a balance between cost savings and performance?
So, the cloud is really helpful here, right? Because we have technologies such as serverless or auto scaling containers. So, these tools that are available make the workloads, um, you know, easier to run, scale, and not have to spend a lot of money. So most people's journeys start out with, they'll run an application on a small VM, right? It has a small footprint. The more it's used, they sometimes quickly just go and add more resources and what we call vertical scaling. And that gets really expensive, and it has kind of a cap on how far you can go, right? You can only add so many resources, and there's only so much you can realistically run on a virtual server, right, at one given time. So, the technologies we have available that allow us to scale workloads quickly and to be able to, spin up more instances and run more workloads and what we call horizontal scaling make this a lot easier, right? There's incentives to run, small, high volume transactions on serverless technology that make it really cost efficient. So, kind of changing the traditional ways we look at the workloads we run and looking at new technologies. And that all ties back to why we do these performance reviews and well architected, right? So it's like, you look at this virtual machine, you've thrown a ton of resources at it, it's really expensive. Well, how about we make, kind of a strategic play to take some of the workloads running there and move them into Lambda, for example. So I think there's a lot of really great tools out there that, if you're aware of them and know how to use them, that can make that a little bit easier of a task.
Okay, so building on that previous question, let's uncover the common obstacles businesses encounter in aligning AWS architecture with broader strategic objectives. So, what are the typical challenges businesses face when trying to align their AWS architecture with broader strategic goals, and how does this review process cater to them?
Well, it's the right tool for the right job too. So, if you're starting out with some small like POC for a product, maybe running this on a single VM, it's quick to set up, it's relatively cheap. So understanding what the purpose is, right? So if I'm building something that needs to scale because, the application is going to be used by a lot of users right off the bat, that's important to know, right? And so not over engineering for something that's going to be used by 5 people in the accounting department. The other thing you have is a lot of applications start out as, something internal, and then, there's an emphasis put on, well, let's take this and, change this into a SaaS platform that we can then sell to customers. So we help people with SaaS readiness all the time. And that, workload looks very different with a handful of users versus what's needed, if I'm going to sell this to an external audience. So just understanding those strategic objectives, why that's happening, when they're happening. And, that's why, again, you're constantly looking at your infrastructure, your architecture, to make sure it aligns with what's actually happening and what you need to support on the business side.
Okay, nice. Now, in terms of scalability, like how these reviews address the challenges associated with rapidly growing AWS workloads while maintaining operational efficiency.
Well, I think it's a continuous improvement thing, right? So scalability kind of is twofold. There's, I want my application to scale, right? So we talked about some of these, technologies that have auto scaling or serverless, but there's also how do I scale out in my cloud environment, right? So when you first start, you might manually configure a lot of things. Like I said, deploy a VM. When you get into, a large footprint infrastructure as a code and tools that help you manage deployment and drift on the cloud become very important, right? So the journey has multiple steps, and again, that's why constantly reviewing and looking at where you're at and where the business is at today and what the demands of, the cloud environment look like today, will help you align and make sure that you're doing the right things.
Okay, and we've gone very, very fast today. We have one last question before jumping into audience Q&A, like very quickly, so we like jump right in. So how often should businesses revisit their AWS architecture to ensure ongoing cost optimization based on evolving needs and recommendations from these reviews?
I'd say at least annually, right? So there's a handful of new
Okay.
services that roll out every year on the AWS side. There's changes in pricing tiers and some of the way services work and what incentives are there for different services. So I'd say at least annually. We do like monthly light reviews for customers. So looking at their cost and going over their bill, security checks, right? The things that you don't want to wait a year to make sure that your security looks good, right? So I think you do them in micro reviews throughout the year, but once a year, really take a look at everything again, do that alignment with strategic goals, and make sure that there aren't new things that you can take advantage of that will either be a cost savings or help with scalability, and whatnot.
That nice. Okay, so we have now we can jump into audience Q&A. Is there anyone who wants to ask Ken? It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, so you would like to ask something.
Unless you know me.
This is Jeff. I'll take advantage of this once in a lifetime opportunity.
Nice.
So Ken, so obviously there's the billing console and there's some native tooling for customers to look at their costs, etc. But what are your thoughts in terms of rolling your own with, say, managed Grafana with third-party tools? Maybe give some insight to. And maybe the answer depends on what your costs are. Managing $1 million a month is a lot different than a couple hundred a month. But what are your thoughts on native tooling versus, rolling your own or going third party with that kind of visibility?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, for us and the size customers we work with in the SMB space, the native tooling works well. They're generally single cloud, may have 3 to 4 cloud accounts under an organizational umbrella, right? So not a huge footprint, but I think when you get to enterprise, and I've worked at very large companies, and you have a lot to consider, right? So you're dealing with multi-cloud and different parts of the business running different AWS organizations. So I think those tools make a ton of sense when you're managing a footprint that big, because trying to aggregate data from multiple consoles for different cloud providers and even multiple organizations under one cloud provider it's like any manual task, right? There's a reason we build data lakes and BI tools for customers, because they have disparate systems, and it's a nightmare trying to gain any insights from the data in those systems. So yeah, I think tools like that make a ton of sense when you're managing a footprint that big.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks for the great question.
Is there any other question you want to ask?
I've got one, but I'll let others speak before I monopolize Ken's time. But if no one else has a question, I've got one.
Yeah, go for it.
Go for it.
Okay.
Yes.
I think one of the hidden costs sometimes is the cost of data transfer. If companies have multiple accounts, they don't realize that AZ1 is not always AZ1 in different accounts. Those are mnemonic labels randomly assigned. So what advice do you have for companies that maybe started off simple, single account, data transfer, egress, not a big deal, but maybe give us some insight as companies grow their footprint on AWS? What should they be looking for in terms of data transfer costs, and are there strategies to kind of help minimize with those costs from creeping up over time?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And it's not even just between environments, right? We constantly help customers evaluate how much data they warehouse, right? From different sources. So one example, recently we had a customer that wanted to ingest like terabytes of data from a third party and do it very quickly, and it's really expensive, right? So um, you know we helped them kind of narrow down what was the important data. Then we also, we're very transparent with them about the cost and help them come up with a plan that would, basically at a transfer rate where there was a comfortable, monthly spend that would work with their budget. So I think, it's hard to, without specific use cases, I think there's different solutions, but I would say best advice is only move what's really important, and just, spend the time to actually look at that transfer cost and, what you're getting into, and is it, at the pace that you actually need this data, right? There's I think a lot of ways to skin that cat, but just being pragmatic and making sure you're having that conversation with stakeholders in the business, to make sure you're not, doing more than what's necessary and incurring unnecessary costs for nice to haves.
Right. Great. Thank you.
Okay, we have more time to some questions. If anyone would like to ask Ken. No? Okay, so I think we are ready to conclude this webinar. We are very thankful for your participation.